Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Zoom Masterclass on hemodialysis led by the joint efforts of Evercare Hospital Dhaka and Unimed Uni Health Pharmaceutical. Both parties respectively are each giving a lecture end-to-end today from 8:30 p.m. Bangladesh time to 9:30 p.m. Non-speaking participants are encouraged to keep their mics muted to avoid distractions. We also want to know that this entire session is being recorded and will be published for viewers who can benefit from it, inshallah. As it's already past 8:30 p.m. now, let me introduce our speaker today from Evercare Hospital, Senior Consultant Nephrologist Dr. Ibadur Rahman. He has had over 10 years of consultant experience abroad prior to joining Evercare, was the only Bangladeshi to be appointed as a chairperson in the Saudi Committee of Organ Transplantation, was appointed regional advisor by the Royal College of Physicians of UK for the Middle Eastern and North African region. And finally, he is a best-selling author for his book on exam questions to prepare with for the neurology specialty certificate exam. Please, Dr. Ibadur Rahman, the floor is yours for you to begin our session.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We start our master class. These are my disclosures. I have taken some images from my book and the guidelines from the KDOQI and KDIGO guidelines. And some of the part of this were presented in renal specialty exam. We'll focus on basics of hemodialysis complication, the CKD mineral bone disease, which was previously known as renal osteodystrophy. The dialysis is basically diffusion, which was actually coined by Thomas Graham in mid-1800. And this is how it looks and it works. We have a semi-permeable membrane, and then you have two fluids flowing on each side of the membrane, and the diffusion takes place across it. This is the membrane, which is a hollow fiber membrane, and you have multiple small tubular structures. These are actually hollow membranes, and this is how it looks. So the blood goes through this membrane, and you have the dialysis across the membrane, and the diffusion takes place across this membrane. This is what a single fiber looks. This is one fiber, and this is the wall of this fiber where the diffusion takes place. So this is the blood where it flows through it, and the dialysis across it, and the membrane which you can see. And this is how the dialysis takes place across this semi-permeable membrane. But in dialysis, unlike diffusion is a static process. There is no movement of the fluids, but in dialysis there is counter-current movement of the fluids. So the dialysis is diffusion in counter-current movement. Okay, so this is how it happens. There is another mechanism in dialysis, and that is convection. And this happens because of movement of fluid across a semi-permeable membrane as a result of artificially created great pressure gradient. So this is the membrane where the blood goes through a thin and a very small diameter membrane. So it will exert a pressure, and it will cause fluid to pass across this porous membrane. So this is called convection. This is how it happens. So the blood flows through the membrane, and it passes, and the solutes, they actually passes because of the pressure exerted by this flowing blood inside the membrane. So the dialysis is basically diffusion, but the diffusion with counter current direction. So the difference between the convection and the diffusion is like this. This is the convection mechanism, where you actually remove the fluid with a pressure gradient through a porous membrane. So you actually basically remove the larger particles, and the smaller particles follows with the larger ones. But in diffusion, it is mainly the smaller particles which are removed, and occasionally you will remove some of the larger particles. So in diffusive clearance, you will actually remove the smaller molecule up to 1,000 molecular weight, depending on the type of membrane you are using. And with the convective clearance, you will remove molecular weight of 10,000 or more. So the dialysis is basically diffusive mechanism plus some convection as well. If you use only the convective force, That means you don't use any dialysate, only you will use fluid in one compartment of the membrane, then we call it hemofiltration. So basically, it is a convective mechanism of fluid and particle removal. If you use both the dialysate and blood, so you use both diffusion and convection, then we call it hemodiafiltration. So basically in hemodiafiltration, you will use dialysate, you will use blood in one compartment, and you will also use replacement fluid. You have another modality where you neither use the dialysate or replacement fluid, you will only use the force of blood to remove the fluids from the patient. So that is known as isolated ultrafiltration. This is basically one sort of convection which is used, and you can use it with your same dialysis machine. If you use hemofiltration or hemodialysis, you can use two types of mechanism. You can replacement fluid. You can use either post-dilution replacement fluid, where you will add the replacement fluid when the blood passes through the membrane and goes back to the patient. So that is known as post-dilution. If you use post-dilution mechanism, then you will have a higher delivered dialysis. The other mechanism is pre-dilution mechanism or pre-dilution method. In that one, you will use the replacement fluid before it enters the membrane. In this one, you will require less anticoagulant, and patients who are having actually problem with coagulation, you can use this modality. Now, these are the examples of diffusive clearance or dialysis. One is intermittent hemodialysis, which is most commonly used in the dialysis units. Then you have the continuous veno-venous hemodialysis. This one is the CRRT, one of the mode of CRRT. And if you do it less than 8 hours or up to 8 hours, then the same one we call SLED or slow, low efficacy dialysis. So SLED, ISD and CVVHD by mechanism is the same thing. Only thing is the duration of delivery. Now about convective clearance, you have, these are the examples of convective clearance. One is hemofiltration or isolated UF, or slow continuous ultrafiltration, or CVVH, continuous veno-venous hemofiltration, or the plasma exchange. In fact, plasma exchange is one sort of convective clearance. Here, actually, you use a plasma filter rather than a hemodialysis filter. Now, so the difference between the SCOOF and the CVVH, SCOOF is slow continuous ultrafiltration, and the CVVH is only the replacement fluid. If you use a replacement fluid, then it is the hemofiltration, and if you use for a longer time, more than 8 hours, then we call it continuous veno-venous hemofiltration. And the SCOOF is the same thing, but you are not using any replacement fluid. SCOOF is mainly used by the cardiothoracic people. If you have actually fluid overload. SCOOF rarely we use in renal transplant patient, especially those patients who received induction therapy with immunomodulators. Now the process of dialysis. This is how it looks. So you have either a fistula or a catheter. In this case, the fistula has been shown. The blood will be drawn with a pump, and then you add heparin, goes to the filter, and then it will be returned back to the patient. That's so simple. Okay. That's the machine, how it looks. And this was the previous machine on the right. And you can see this is the filter. This is almost 1 meter long filter, and the machine looks almost like a weaving machine. And this is the machine of today. It is only about 1.5 feet in length compared to the 1 meter filter, which used to be used previously. The dialysis actually was coined long before, and it was actually coined in 1888 by William Carter, who was the president of Royal College of Physicians. And then it was first used by George Haas in a human experiment, and it was first. This is the machine. Actually, you can see it was really a horrendous machine. For dialysis, you actually use ultra pure water. For that, you need actually a water treatment system. This is the water treatment system where the raw water passes through softener, and then the particle filter, carbon absorption, then it goes to reverse osmosis filter, and then through the ultraviolet filter, it goes to the treated water tank, and then it goes to the individual machines. The machines then it take this water and it will combine with the acid concentrate and the bicarb concentrate and the water which I have shown. The machine will make the final dialysate, and that final dialysate will be used for hemodialysis. So basically, you need actually very safe water treatment plant to have all this. Okay. Now we'll come to the common dialysis issues. Now let's see what are the common dialysis issues with these people, with these dialysis people. So one of the common dialysis issues is intradialytic hypotension. So, and this actually requires frequent intervention. Now let's do this exercise. This is a 60-year-old recently started on hemodialysis, gets frequent hypotension. Which of the following ultrafiltration rate would produce hypotension in most patients? An ultrafiltration rate of more than 0.15 ml per kg per minute, an ultrafiltration rate more than 0.30 ml per kg per minute, an ultrafiltration rate more than 0.10 ml per minute, an ultrafiltration rate more than 0.35, an ultrafiltration rate more than 0.5. I think this one will definitely create hypotension in all the patients. But the one which will cause hypotension in all of them is actually something if you exceed more than 0.35 ml per kg per minute. Okay. So an ultrafiltration rate of more than 0.35 ml will actually cause hypotension in most of the patients. Usually 20% reduction in plasma volume are generally well tolerated. 1.1 liter of ultrafiltration power per hour in chronic hemodialysis patient will be also tolerated. But the maximum ultrafiltration should not be exceeded more than 10 ml per kg per hour. For example, you have a patient of 100 kg, so 1 liter per hour should actually be the maximum ultrafiltration for that patient. The hypotension can be dialysis is usually because of unadjusted dry body weight or use of antihypertensive medications on the dialysis day, cardiac arrhythmias, bacterial sepsis, hemorrhage, ingestion of food during dialysis, anemia, dialysis associated L-carnitine deficiency, or autonomic. These are actually common causes of hypotension in dialysis patients. So this is the Renal Association recommendation for treating the hypotension during dialysis. One is you restrict the sodium intake, reduce the dry body weight, reduce antihypertensive drugs, increase the duration of dialysis to reduce hourly ultrafiltration rate, and to use cooled hemodialysis, temperature dialysis, and sodium remodeling or sodium modeling. In fact. So assessment of dry body weight can be done by either bioelectric impedance or by vena cava ultrasound. So, but also the machine can do it. This is known as online blood volume monitoring. Although this is controversial, but actually it works. So in dialysis, what to use for the hypotensive patient, whether you use saline or albumin, but there is actually no difference between saline or salt poor albumin. Albumin is very expensive, so saline can do the job. So these are the preventive strategies: correct the anemia, correct hypoalbuminemia, all withdrawal of antihypertensive drugs before the dialysis, avoid food during dialysis, counsel the patient for weight gain, and if they have congestive cardiac failure, arrhythmias and pericardial effusion, treat them as well. Finally, the last option is to use midodrine or L-carnitine or sertraline pre-dialysis. These are actually preventive rather than curative treatment option. Now come to the intradialytic hypertension. This occurs in about 8% to 30% of treatments. So a patient can have actually 30% treatment a raised blood pressure during dialysis. So this is quite common actually. So regarding intradialytic hypertension, blood pressure control is not achieved despite fluid removal in up to 50% patients, in up to 20%, in up to 30%, in up to 10%, or none of the above. So let's try this quiz. So in fact, blood pressure control is not achieved despite of fluid removal in up to 50% of your patients. And the potential mechanisms are the fluid overload, sympathetic overactivity, activation of renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, endothelial dysfunction, or the net sodium gain, or high calcium dialysate, or hypokalemia. I think all of the dialysis centers here in Bangladesh, they're using actually 2K bath and high calcium bath. So that's actually probably the cause of hypertension in most of our cases. Again, the erythropoietin during the dialysis and removal of antihypertensive medications can actually all cause intradialytic hypertension. There is one phenomenon which is known as volume-independent hypertension in dialysis. In this patient, they have actually volume depletion. Despite of that, they are getting hypertensive episodes during dialysis. This is thought to be pre-existing hypertension or because of hypercalcemia, which induces inotropism and fast. And our high calcium dialysis reason. And the other issue is hypokalemia. That actually increases the renin-angiotensin secretion and can cause actually hypertension. How to manage if these hypertensive episodes? If this patient have signs and symptoms of volume contraction, if the signs of symptoms of volume contractions are lacking, in that case, you can still try to reduce the dry body weight to half kg or so and observe. Second thing is that you can actually increase the ultrafiltration time and the frequency of dialysis. The other one is you can actually use EPO subcutaneous rather than IV. The other one is you can actually use non-dialyzable antihypertensive medications like captopril in case of ACE, nifedipine in case of calcium channel blocker, clonidine, and carvedilol. These are the list of medications which are actually removed by the dialysis. You can see losartan is not been removed and carvedilol. That's why most of the people who are working with me, you will find that I am using actually carvedilol a lot because I know this is not actually dialyzable. So other way to actually reduce the hypertensive episodes are actually prolonged dialysis. So you have seen with me when I am rounding, I actually prolong dialysis for many of the patients who are having hypertension. And you can also give short frequent dialysis, or rarely you can actually switch to peritoneal dialysis. And these are the actually references. Now let's do this exercise. Your dialysis duty doctor called you for a patient with a pre-dialysis potassium of 8. You will advise a potassium bath of 0K, 1K, 2K, 3K, or 4K. So the question is, the patient is having a potassium of 8, which bath you will be using? Whenever I coined this question, everybody chose actually 0K, but actually that's the wrong answer. The answer is 2K. And let me give you the recommendation. This is the recommendation. If you have a potassium of less than 4.5, you use a dialysate potassium of 4. So that's the recommendation. If your potassium is between 4.5 to 5.5, you use a 3K bath. Between 5.5 to 8, you use a 2K bath. It's more than 8, you use only 1K. 0 potassium bath is extremely dangerous. Nobody uses. Unfortunately, in our country, we have only 2 potassium bath, and we're using the same bath for everybody, and that is actually dangerous. Now, sudden death in dialysis, this is a common issue, and dialysis death is really is a big issue. So, 42% of dialysis patients they actually dies sudden cardiac, and these are actually sudden cardiac origin. Based on data from the United States renal data system, 22% deaths are related to cardiac arrest and arrhythmia. Now let's do this exercise. Patient who is least likely to sustain a cardiac arrest in the dialysis facility tend to be A, older, B, diabetic, C, dialyzing with a catheter for vascular access, D, had a recent hospitalization, E, dialyzing with a fistula. I actually found nobody answering, giving me correct answer for this one when I was conducting the specialty exam course. This one is actually opposite of what you think. The one who is dialyzing with the fistula has the highest rate of death in a cardiac arrest. This is probably only disadvantage of fistula for the over the catheter, and the probably only catheter advantage over the fistula. I should rather say like that. So, and then if you have patients who have ejection fraction less than 30%, you can actually consider ICD implantation if you think that these patients have a life expectancy greater than 1 year. That can also prevent sudden cardiac death. Now, let's see this exercise. 60-year-old diabetic on hemodialysis with the left AVF recently had CABG. For the last 2 sessions of hemodialysis, he is complaining of chest pain. Repeat coronary angiogram was showed actually patent anastomosis. Hemoglobin 11, ESR 40, upper GI endoscopy was normal, CT chest normal. So what is the possible diagnosis? So these are the diagnoses we are offering. One is Dressler syndrome, sternal osteomyelitis, atelectasis, Steele syndrome from internal thoracic graft during hemodialysis, and the reflux esophagitis. So that was the patient complaining of chest pain. This patient had actually CABG, but repeat angiogram did not show anything. Hemoglobin is okay, upper GI endoscopy is okay, chest, CT chest is normal. So what is the possible diagnosis? So if you have normal CT chest, probably you are actually excluding the sternal osteomyelitis, Dressler syndrome, and atelectasis. And you have done an endoscopy, so there is nothing there. So the answer is probably Steele from internal thoracic artery graft. So if you do actually internal memory of thoracic artery graft, and if you use this one for CABG, there is a risk of internal thoracic artery Steele actually. So this was published with one of our colleagues. So what is the Steele stage of this patient? So this is one of the patient complains of pain, and we had a Doppler study, and then we found that this patient has Steele. But by looking at it, what is the stage of the Steele? Is it stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, or stage 5? You can easily exclude stage 5 because there's nothing called stage 5. Only there is 4 stages of Steele. Now this one is actually stage 4 Steele. Stage 1 Steele is when you have only Doppler evidence of Steele. That is retrograde diastolic flow without complaints. Stage 2 is the patient has pain during exertion or during dialysis. Stage 3 is they have rest pain. And stage 4 is you have ulceration, necrosis, and rest pain, and plus minus gangrene. So this patient actually has stage 4 Steele. Okay. So these are the clinical features of Steeles. Actually, they have numb hand, coolness of the distal arm, diminished pulses, and acrocyanosis, and as this patient, this has gangrene as well. And how to evaluate? We actually look by pulse oximetry. You can feel the hand, and the hand will be cooler. Doppler flow study is the one which you use, and you can actually use angiography. So, depending on the flow values, the Steele can be actually either high flow Steele. If you have a flow rate more than 800 to 1200, then we call it high flow. Normal flow Steele, or you have low flow Steele. If you have low flow Steele, then this Steele, this fistula needs to be ligated. But if you have a high flow Steele, then you have some options. And these are the options. These are actually mainly surgical options. The most common option is the banding of the fistula. The other options are drill process, where actually you make a bypass graft between the fistula and the distal artery. The Rudy and Pye procedures are actually rarely performed. Drill and banding are the most commonly used procedures. Now, we actually do not need vascular surgeons. Now, our interventionist can actually do these things by placing balloon at the anastomotic area. This is the patient who has steel. You can see there is no flow, and then the balloon was placed, and then they maintain the flow. Okay, now steel actually will actually, other than steel, you can also have other problems if you have higher flow. The patient who have blood flow greater than 4 liters per minute will develop left ventricular hypertrophy, and also they will develop heart failure. So if your blood flow to cardiac output ratio is more than 0.3, that means if your blood flow, excess flow is 30% of the cardiac output, then you probably develop heart failure. Another issue is because all this blood is going to the pulmonary tree, so you will also develop actually pulmonary artery hypertension. But there is a small test which is known as Branham sign. This one you can easily do bedside. You can actually compress the fistula, and if your pulse rate goes 7 beats down, then you can actually say that there is significant shunt and which is causing hemodynamic abnormality. So now, if they develop heart failure, your options are actually limited. I think nobody will do banding. They will actually go for the ligation of the axis. That's a pity. Let's do this one. You have a 60-year-old recently started dialysis. She was just discharged from ICU, and she had a hernia repair, and she had an MI in the ICU. Now this patient is recovered from MI. Now she's dialyzing, and the dialysis technician noted that this patient's oximetry goes from 97 to 85 during dialysis. So you have done a chest X-ray, which is normal. ECG was compared with the previous ECG. There is no interval change. So what makes this condition worse? Is it cooled dialysate? Is it synthetic membrane, acetate dialysate, bicarbonate dialysate, or intradialytic oxygen? So this one, actually, if you see the data which I presented, this is a very common phenomenon. You will see during dialysis, their saturation is gradually going down, although you are actually ultrafiltrating the patient. But this is actually dialysis-associated hypoxemia. And in fact, you can treat them with cool dialysate, with synthetic membrane, with bicarbonate dialysate and intradialytic oxygen. But only thing which worsens this one is actually acetate dialysis. So if you have acetate dialysate, that will actually worsen this one. So this is actually transient hypoxemia of dialysis. This occurs up to in 90% patients because we are not actually measuring the oximetry, but around about 90% patients will develop this one, and defined as a drop of oxygen between 5 to 30 millimeter mercury, and this returns to normal within 1 to 2 hours if the dialysis is discontinued. It's more common with the cellulose membrane, less with the synthetic membrane. And mild reduction of this oxygen will not actually do anything, but those who have clinically significant cardiac disease, they are the one who are getting the problems. The diagnosis is by oximetry, and the treatment is used bicarbonate dialysate, and the bicarbonate concentration in the dialysis should be less than 37. And you can also give intradialytic oxygen supplementation, and you can do sequential ultrafiltration, those who have fluid overload, and use the biocompatible membrane, and cool dialysate can also ameliorate this situation. This one. Now let's do this one. So we have a 55-year-old diabetic on hemodialysis on transplant base. She's dialyzing, and with a gradual onset of shortness of breath and recent history of back pain. So these are the data. You can see hemoglobin is a little bit low. The creatinine is 430, and PTH is 1100. The KT/V is not that bad, 1.2. Calcium is 2.5, and the phosphate is too, not that bad. She's on Civilamar 800 TID, and patient is seen by the dietitian, and she commented that she has very good compliance. This is her X-ray, and you can see the X-ray with a lot of fluffy shadow in the lung, and it's full of these shadows. And this is the bone biopsy, and you can see these are the giant osteoclast in the bone biopsy. This is the tetracycline leavening. You can see the tetracycline deposited in the osteoid. So, what are the treatment options? So, daily dialysis, increase the Civilamar, add cinacalcet, add vitamin D, parathyroid. So, if you go back to the case, so this is actually a case where you can see the phosphate is acceptable, and this patient is actually having very high PTH. Although she's having very good compliance with the dietitian, and she's on Civilamar, but still she has soft tissue calcification. In this case, the lung calcification you can see, and also these are actually giant osteoclasts. The osteoitis fibrosa cystica by biopsy. So this one actually need parathyroidectomy. Okay, so that's so the indication of parathyroidectomy are actually now getting parathyroidectomy is getting less common nowadays, but these are the indications. If you have a persistent hyperphosphatemia, unresponsive to calcitriol and calcium, you have and the patients are actually, if they are a renal transplant candidate, or if you have evidence of metastatic calcification, and or if you have evidence of calciphylaxis with hyperparathyroidism. And sometimes, if you have severe pruritus and you don't have any clue which is causing, and you have in the background hyperparathyroidism, then parathyroidectomy is done. This is the normal bone in comparison to the one which I have shown you. This is the abnormal, this is the normal bone, and that's how it looks with hyperparathyroidism. Now, this is the TMB classification. Now, the previous term renal osteodystrophy has been changed, so now we call it actually a chronic kidney disease, mineral and bone disorder, CKD MBD, and this is based on TMB classification. Although it is an old classification, but still it has been used. It is based on the turnover of the bone, mineralization, and the volume. The turnover can be either low, normal, or high, and the same for the mineralization and for the volume. Now, the intact PTH values actually will give you an idea what type of bone disease this patient has. If the value is below 100, you're dealing probably with adynamic bone disease. If the value is above 450, you're probably dealing with hyperparathyroid bone disease. If it is between 100 to 450, you're probably dealing with normal dynamic bone disease. Alkaline phosphatase is also a very good tool. If you have a combination of low serum bone specific alkaline phosphatase with a low PTH, that will suggest actually a low turnover bone disorder. And if you have the opposite, that means high PTH and high alkaline phosphatase, then you are actually dealing with a high turnover bone disease. Bone biopsy is the gold standard for diagnosing bone disease. However, rarely performed, and you only do in this situation if you have unexplained fracture, unexplained hypercalcemia, unexplained hypophosphatemia, or persistent bone pain, and you're suspecting aluminum toxicity, or if you are planning to give bisphosphonate, then it's better to do a bone biopsy. Now, secondary hyperparathyroidism, these are the abnormalities you get actually. You get actually phosphate retention, decrease free ionized calcium concentration, decrease vitamin D, and increase fibroblast growth factor 23, that is FGF23. And also you have reduction in vitamin D receptor, calcium sensing receptor, fibroblast growth factor receptors, and phosphoreceptor in the parathyroid. This is the patient which have actually hyperparathyroid bone disease. You can see actually bone actually gets erased, right? But the soft tissue calcification is the one which they get. And also the arterial calcification is another problem with this entity. Let's come to this one. You have a 65-year-old diabetic on hypertension with polyarthralgia. This is actually our case, which is dialyzing in Evercare Hospital. The KT overview, you can see is good, 1.8, hemoglobin is 9, MCV is 65, ferritin is 500, calcium is 2.6, phosphate 1.6, PTH 230, TSAT is 30, she has also joint pain, myalgia, lethargy. She's on diet reporting and on monthly iron. This is the bone biopsy, but this was not from this patient. This is I'm just showing for the academic purpose. The biopsy was done, and the orin carboxylic acid stain was done, and you can see this is the osteoid stain with the orin carboxylic. If you know the stain, then you will know the answer. So, what is the best option for correcting anemia in this patient? Change to erythropoietin, hemoglobin electrophoresis to know what is the cause of anemia, IV iron, desferrexamine, or vitamin C. Okay, so this go back to the case. This is the biopsy. Orin carboxylic acid stain will stain actually aluminium. So this patient has actually aluminium deposition in the osteoid, and if you see, this patient has microcytic anemia despite of good ferritin. So microcytic anemia, joint pain, and all these things gives you a diagnosis of aluminium toxicity. So this patient actually is our patient. You can see this is the lady. I took permission to give a picture, and the biopsy was not from her, but her aluminium level was actually very high. It was more than 30 actually. So aluminium accumulation will give you actually adenemic bone disease. It causes actually reversible microcytic anemia. It causes PTH suppression. It is more seen with the diabetic, and it will actually give you an adenemic type of bone disease. So you will get actually hypercalcemia, microcytic anemia, because they become resistant to iron supplement. And patients, they actually complain of generalized bone pain, muscle ache, and PTH actually gives you a protection against aluminium. So these patients actually usually are with suppressed PTH. Calcitriol, they will actually accelerate the aluminium bone disease. And the joint symptom, if you have joint symptom, that means you have very high concentration of aluminium in the joint. And the anemia in these patients are actually due to bone marrow impaired function. This is the guideline for the treatment of aluminium bone disease, and actually our patient falls in this category. Her aluminium level is between 20 to 60. Because she has a lot of symptoms, we decided to give her desferrexamine. And the dose is between 5 milligram per kg IV. At the last hour of dialysis, you give them once per week. The problem with the adynamic bone disease is, this is the normal dynamic bone disease where the calcium is taken by the bone and little bit of calcium is released in the system. But in adynamic bone disease, the calcium is repelled from the bone because bone is sleeping, in fact. So the calcium and phosphate, they are repelled from the bone, and they will cause calcification of soft tissue. So even with the hyperdynamic bone disease, which I have shown you before, the adynamic bone disease will cause the same phenomenon. So in these cases, try to avoid calcium containing binders, and try to avoid vitamin D. So now, which of the following drugs offer maximum phosphate removal in equivalent metric dose? Is it sevelamer? Is it calcium carbonate? Is it calcium acetate? Is it lanthanum carbonate? Is it aluminium? Okay, so that's the data you can see. Actually, calcium carbonate 1 gram will bind actually 40 milligram of phosphate. Acetate will be a little bit more. Sevelamer 36, lanthanum 93, it's very high. Aluminium 25. So the maximum binding capacity is lanthanum, followed by the calcium acetate. However, the problem with the lanthanum and the all others, they actually they accumulates in the tissue. The only one which is not accumulated in the tissue is actually sevelamer. Plus the only one which also reduces the cholesterol. So this is the guideline for the management of renal CKD MBD. So if you have a calcium phosphate product less than 5, then you look at the PTH. If the PTH is low, then you stop all the calcium vitamin D. If the PTH is high, you can still give them a little bit of calcium, and you can actually give them vitamin D. If the PTH is at the target range, then you can actually increase the vitamin D. Now, if the calcium phosphate product is higher and PTH is low, then you consider actually adenemic bone disease, stop all the calcium containing medications. If the PTH is elevated and the phosphate is high, then you should actually do dietary consultation and actually stop vitamin D. If the calcium is high, in that case, you use calcium-free binders like Sevelamer. If the PTH is grossly high, just like our first case, you actually consider subtotal parathyroidectomy. But nowadays, I think most of the physicians will actually try cinacalcet and pericalcitriol combination, and if it fails, then they will go for the parathyroidectomy. Now, this is the phosphate binder and motility. So if you use, actually, most of us are using actually calcium containing phosphate binder, they actually will actually increase all-cause mortality if you compare with the Sevelamer. And the same thing, if you use calcium containing binders, you will have higher incidence of arrhythmias and cardiac mortality compared to Sevelamer. The other one is the pericalcitriol. Pericalcitriol is a non-calciumic vitamin D. It is actually synthetic vitamin D analog. And this one actually effectively reduces the PTH without causing hypercalcemia. Unlike vitamin D, it was hypercalcemia plus reduction of PTH. The issue and the advantage of this one is if you use this one, and if you see the OPERA trial, the trial result actually they showed actually there's reduction of left ventricular mass index over 52 weeks if you use actually pericalcitriol. So, our recommendation is to use low calcium dialysate, which is now not available in our country. Non-calcium phosphate binder like Sevelamer or lanthanum, and non-calciumic vitamin D like pericalcitriol. We have, I think, Uniplar available here, and in Saudi Arabia we had Zamplar. Okay, now let's do this one. This is a 56-year-old lady, came with painful rash. Primary disease is lupus nephritis, recently developed diabetes, history of back pain, successfully treated for hepatitis B, and she is being prepared for transplant. This is her lab, and you can see the PTH is also high. Calcium is a little bit in high range, and she's on calcitriol, calcium acetate, Iprex, and monthly iron. So this is the rash. And then this is the rash after 3 days. Then a dermatology consultation was done, and they did a biopsy, and you can see this is an venule, and you can see denuded endothelium. This is the bone scan. This patient, this was done previously, and then this is after the rash came. You can see there's high lung uptake and also high uptake in the soft tissue and in the leg. This is an X-ray of the spine. This is Ragar-Jersey spine, and also you can see arterial calcification in this X-ray. So, what is the diagnosis? Is it the relapse of SLE? Is it cryoglobulinemia because she has hepatitis B, or is it calciphylaxis? Is it necrotizing fasciitis, or is it herpes zoster? This is actually calciphylaxis. This is the advanced calciphylaxis, and the one which I have shown you, this was just developing. But this patient has actually calciphylaxis. The calciphylaxis is rare but serious disorder in ESRD, and this is usually seen with elevated PTH, elevated phosphate, and calcium. And those who have recently received transplant, they are also, if they have high PTH, they are also at high risk of calciphylaxis. Most commonly present at thigh and in fatty tissues. And skin lesions are characterized by painful, non-ulcerating subcutaneous nodules or plaques. Okay, calciphylaxis can also happen in non-uremic patients. So either in SLE, Sjogren's syndrome, primary hyperparathyroidism, rheumatoid arthritis, sarcoidosis, and Crohn's disease. This patient actually was a patient of SLE, so plus CKD. So she was actually in higher risk, and plus obese patient. Now, risk of developing calciphylaxis actually more in females, those who are ESRD and BMI more than 30, and those who have high calcium phosphate product and PTH, those who are on warfarin, and those who are on calcium and vitamin D analogs. So skin biopsy is usually avoided. You don't do skin biopsy because this can actually cause active infection, and also they can also cause a coagulant type of phenomenon. Ulceration have a mortality of 80%. 1 year survival with calcium sphylaxis is only 45%, and 67% will die with sepsis. So what is the treatment? Treatment is actually aggressive wound management. And then you have to increase the dialysis dose. Previously, they used to say dialysis every day, but now the new recommendation is you just actually have to have the target KT over V. You have to lower the calcium phosphate product below 55 or below 5. You can use cinacalcet rather than vitamin D. You can use sevelamer or lanthanum. Use sodium thiosulfate. It's not probably available here, but I have to use in Saudi Arabia. And you have to use 25 grams. You have to give over 1 hour and 3 times a week. It's very expensive. And if the patient is on warfarin, you have to stop them. And if all of them are resistant, then you have to go for hyperbaric oxygen therapy. Because I used to work in a military hospital, they had this facility. Okay, now, this is a case, 40 years old female. She's not still on dialysis, but these are the data. But you can see they are more or less acceptable, but the vitamin D is only 17. The normal is at least it has to be more than 25. So select one prescription. Would you give vitamin D, cinacalcet, sevelamer, 1-alpha, or would you give calcium carbonate? So actually the answer is you have to give them vitamin D. Those patients who have very low vitamin D, although you can argue this will not be useful for CKD patient, but those 25 hydroxy vitamin D has its own function. So if it is very low, it's better to actually replace. It is good for the bone health. Little bit of catheter issues. This is a patient on hemodialysis with a permanent catheter, comes with fever, and this is a swab taken from the catheter exit. You can see a leukopenia, and the patient has low hemoglobin, and this is the gram stain, and this is the calcofluor white stain with fluorescence. So what to start? Will you give cascofungin, fluconazole, ampho-B, voriconazole, or itraconazole? This is actually candidemia. This is actually candida exit infection, and this patient probably has candidemia. So in this option, cascofungin is the drug, but you can also use enalaronfungin, and you can use even fluconazole if you don't have candida krusei. So after starting antimicrobial, how often you should do blood culture? Daily, every 2 days, every 3 days, every 4 days, or after 1 week? The answer is you have to do daily culture if you have fungal infection. Okay? Because for fungal infection, you have to give a minimum of 2 weeks therapy from the first negative. So you do culture every day. The day when it became negative, from that day, you have to give 2 weeks of antibiotic, and you have to remove the catheter, and you should also examine the eye because they can cause actually ophthalmitis. And if you have problem with candida glabrata and krusei, then it is better to use echinocandin. Now, following are the risk factor for hemodialysis catheter infection except recent surgery, diabetes mellitus, iron overload, hypoalbuminemia, or HIV infection. So which one does not increase the catheter infection risk? So the answer is actually HIV infection. It actually does not increase the catheter risk. It actually has higher risk with peritoneal dialysis infection. These are the risk factors for bacterial infection with catheter. So if you have biofilm, recent surgery, diabetes, iron overload, hypoalbuminemia, recent surgery, but HIV infection is in risk for PD, not for hemodialysis. And the cuffed catheter, it protects, so better to use a tunnel cuff catheter if you're using for more than 15 days. Most of the infections are actually with coagulous negative staph, and gram negative is around 30%, and 10% actually get polymicrobial. You can actually both gram positive and gram negative. And metastatic infection, if you find them, you always think about staph. Because you can have actually both polymicrobial, so the guideline is to use vancomycin and gentamicin. These are the data for the catheter infection, and this is the reference. So these are the different infection, different definition of infection, but only thing should remember is the refractory infection. And this is actually if you are putting the patient on sensitive antibiotic, but still the patient is septic for 48 hours, that is known as refractory infection. In these cases, you should actually take out the catheter. And how long you should treat? This is the algorithm for treatment. And you can actually see, you should actually treat them, if you remove the catheter, you should treat them at least for 7 to 10 days. If it is uncomplicated catheter infection, you can keep the catheter and treat for 3 weeks. If you have endocarditis, you treat it for 6 weeks. If you have osteomyelitis, you treat it for 8 weeks. So now, this is most likely organism to be isolated with this type of access. This is one of my patients in Saudi Arabia. So, what sort of organism will grow with the catheter infection of this access? First, what is this access? This is actually transhepatic perm cath. So, I think gram negative is the answer, because these patients, the liver works as a filter for the gram negative organism. So if you have actually transhepatic perm cath, you can have gram negative sepsis more than gram positive. So this is my paper which is published here. Now, this is a 60-year-old patient on hemodialysis with the perm cath, comes with a fever. This is you can see the WBC count is a little bit high, a little bit hypotensive. So what is the best management for this catheter? So these are the options. Will you give just vancomycin and gentamicin? Will you give cefalozole and gentamicin? Will you remove the catheter and give vancomycin and gentamicin for 14 days? Or will you change the catheter over guide wire and continue the sensitive antibiotic for 2 weeks? Or will you give vancomycin and gentamicin catheter lock as well? The guideline is actually, if you have uncomplicated catheter infection, you can actually just change with the guide wire and then continue for 2 weeks with the sensitive antibiotic. But you start actually with the vanco and gentamicin. Okay. Now, these are the recommendations for the removal of catheter. So if you have tunnel infection, pass at the exit site, severe sepsis, hemodynamic instability, evidence of metastatic infection, if the fever and bacteremia persist beyond 48 hours, even you have given the antibiotic for susceptible organism, or if you have difficult to cure pathogens like Pseudomonas candida or fungi. And these are the guidelines for the catheter lock. You can use actually cefazolin, vancomycin, gentamicin, all these things. These are the concentration you should use. I think this is the last one. 60-year-old male started on dialysis for 4th consecutive session through a temporary jugular catheter. Now, he has also history of COPD, hepatitis C, and pulmonary hypertension. So this is the data. The patient has hemoglobin 9, platelets 30,000, WBC count 10,000, and the catheter flow is very poor. And the hemodialysis technician reported that there is no flow from the arterial port. I think someone is talking, I think. Okay. What is the next step of management? Epoprostenol, Hirudin, or Algotropan, Danapril, or enoxaparin. Okay. So if you see the data, this patient actually has COPD, this patient has hepatitis C, has pulmonary hypertension. So if you have, and also probably liver impairment with the hepatitis C. So in these cases, actually, you choose something which will work for the pulmonary hypertension and which is not actually problematic for the liver. So in this case, epoprostenol is the one which is good for the pulmonary hypertension, and ergotraben you use with caution with CLD. This patient is actually with the hepatitis C as well. Now, so this patient actually developed heparin-induced thrombocytopenia or HIT type 2. We have actually 2 types of HIT. And HIT develops because of an antigen which is negatively charged, and it actually binds with the charged protein tetramer, which comes from the platelets. So, and this is more actually common with low molecular heparin, but with high molecular heparin or unfractionated one, but also it has been seen with low molecular weight heparin. The HIT type 1 is just reduction of the platelet, and this is actually an allergic phenomenon. This is non-immunological phenomenon. Usually it recovers within 3 days, and it's not a problem at all. For type 2, there will be sustained fall in platelet, and the count actually goes below 50,000, and usually occurs between 4 to 14 days, occurs with any dose of and with any route, and induce a immunological mechanism, and this actually causes more thrombosis rather than bleeding. And the diagnosis is actually based on absence of any other clear clue for thrombocytopenia, the timing of thrombocytopenia, the degree of thrombocytopenia, and the positive lab test for HIT antibodies. The HIT has 18% mortality, 5% would require actually some sort of amputation. That's not a good thing. And overt bleeding and bruising are rare. So if you have these things, you actually think something else. The appropriate management actually can limit morbidity and mortality. Anticoagulation issues, as I said, either you can use argatropan or you can use lipyridine. And because low molecular weight has cross reactivity, we're not really using low molecular weight heparin for HIT. These are the do's and don'ts for HIT. And for HIT, these are the agents which you can use. Do not use warfarin, platelet, vena-cava filter, low molecular weight in HIT. Catheter occlusion with HIT, you can actually manage them with urochyme and any other thrombolysis. But these thrombolysis you can actually use for any sort of catheter dysfunction if it is because of thrombus. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibadur sir, for a wonderful presentation. Assalamu alaikum, dear participant. I am Mashur Rahman, Senior Officer Pharmaceutical. Just wait for a while. We are going to have a 5-minute presentation regarding our company brand, Renosef. It's a 7-hour tablet preparation. So dear participant, to just wait for a while, we'll have a presentation. We'll take just 5 minutes. Welcome to Unihealth Pharmaceutical. We are going to discuss in this slide, why should we control hyperphosphatemia, complications of hyperphosphatemia, management of hyperphosphatemia. Hyperphosphatemia, we know that it's a hidden killer in chronic kidney disease. Overall, an estimated 5 to 10 million people die annually from chronic kidney disease. We know an average man has a phosphorus level between 0.81 millimole to 1.45 millimole per liter. The distribution of phosphorus in bone teeth is 14%, intracellular is 1%, and extracellular is 85%. Causes of hyperphosphatemia: due to increased phosphate intake, decreased phosphate excretion, disorders that shifts intracellular phosphate to extracellular space. We know the prevalence of chronic kidney disease is 10.4% among men, 11.8% among women. Higher levels of serum phosphate were associated with an increased risk of coronary death. The complications of CKD are related to nephropathy, cardiovascular disease, mineralized bone disorder, and the least anemia. Why disordered mineral metabolism is the complication of CKD? We know that CKD and MPD is a common complication of CKD and is a broad spectrum disorders of mineral metabolism. It is characterized by the following: abnormalities of calcium, phosphorus, PTH or vitamin D metabolism, abnormalities in bone turnover, mineralization, volume, linear growth, vascular or other soft tissue calcification. Extraskeletal calcification consequences. Extraskeletal consequences of the vascular system increases progressively, declining eGFR, and is more prevalent, severe and accelerated in CKD patient. Accordingly, vascular calcification is a major contributor to cardiovascular disease in CKD patients. Observational data indicate vascular calcification predicts cardiovascular mortality. Diabetes is the biggest contributor to CKD and end-stage renal diseases. Diabetes and kidney function in Bangladesh. This is a data provided by an article in BirdM. In BirdM 2014, prevalence of nephropathy was 25%, male 27% and female 22% found among 400 type 2 diabetes mellitus patients. Microalbuminuria were found in 24% of type 1 diabetes and 27% of type 2 diabetes patients. In Bangladesh, the cause of CKD G5 among 954 patients were on hemodialysis in 2012 and 2013 were diabetic nephropathy. These are the reference article I have discussed previously in my slide. Hospital-based prevalence of chronic kidney disease among the newly registered patients with diabetes. Another reference article, prevalence of chronic kidney disease stages 3 to 5 among patients with type 2 diabetes mellitus in Bangladesh. And the phosphate binders, the limitations of phosphate binders, the administration agent to bind phosphate in food usually required as CKD progresses. Agents containing calcium are inexpensive and well tolerated, but they may contribute to vascular calcification. Our Honorable Ibadu sir has earlier told that sevelamer carbonate is only the preparation that do not cause vascular calcification. For sevelamer carbonate preparation, we have Renocef. It's an 800 mg tablet and it's 50 taka per tablet. The cheapest tablet available in market. Significantly decreases serum phosphorus in CKD patients. Significantly reduces the risk of vascular calcification. That is, this is the only preparation that lowers the cholesterol level compared to other preparation. Renocef, serum phosphorus level 5.5 to 7.5. One tablet 3 times daily with meals. And if the phosphorus level is above 7.5 milligram per deciliter, it's 2 tablets 3 times per day with meals. Thank you. Now I would like to request Ibadu sir to close the session.
We are already late, so if anyone has any questions, they can actually send me an email. That will be easy. But I can take only 1 or 2 questions. Because if someone asked that there's any benefit of maintenance hemodiafiltration over maintenance hemodialysis in ASRD patient. The problem with the hemodiafiltration in our sort of setting, for hemodiafiltration, you need actually a very good quality of water. Unfortunately, the water test, many dialysis centers they're not doing, and the ultra pure water. If you really do not have the ultra pure water, it's not actually advisable to do hemodiafiltration. But if you see the TASIN data was actually done for home hemodialysis patient, and they are actually all using hemodialysis mode. They were all using low flux movement. Their mortality was better than the ordinary those who are dialyzing in center-based hospitals. There is one more question. I think we lost few patients with the sudden death at initiation of hemodialysis. Would you please make a comment on for the hemodialysis sudden death? I think this is more common with those who are crash landers starting dialysis at late. Those who have multiple comorbidity and starting dialysis late. Those who are having a septic condition on top of their chronic illness, they are also having higher mortality. In general, first 3 months for those who are actually starting unplanned dialysis, the mortality is quite high, and then it actually settles. But dialysis mortality in general actually is much more higher than chronic carcinoma. I think many of the patients, they do not know, they should be educated. Dialysis is actually is a procedure to delay the death. It's actually it's not the 100% renal replacement. 100% renal replacement you probably get with the transplant, not with dialysis. I think we should stop here.
Thank you, sir.